Do we want to just go right into it?
I think we can jump into it, yeah.
Okay, so this is a very new and interesting type of episode for 27 because we have an actual guest with us. So we're really excited to introduce you all to Elie Hutchinson. Elie, do you want to give a quick introduction to who you are, what you do, and why you're here?
Sure thing. Well, I'm here because Jean asked me to be. We were classmates back at USC at the design school at Roski. And I'm glad we've kept in touch. So a little about me. I am professionally a graphic designer, art director type. I say type because I feel like all of us do a lot of things, it turns out, especially when we start at small agencies where you have to wear a lot of hats. So that was definitely my experience where right after college, I moved back to Washington, D.C., which is where I'm originally from, and immediately started working at a small advertising agency, the usual thing, doing everything from like buses to print to digital banner ads, the whole rigmarole. And that's where I spent the next 3 years. And during that time, I guess I had been working on this pet project off and on since graduating college. Sort of like that summer you spend after college looking for work. I needed something to stay sane and to have a creative outlet. So I started my company, which is called Lorica Clothing. It is based on the premise of me designing clothes that look like armor. And whenever people hear that, they're like, eyebrow raise, like, what does that mean? And it is literally what it sounds like. I go to museums. I do a lot of research and studying in general to sort of understand the way that historical armor works, and then to the best of my ability, try to replicate it on things like leggings, rash guards, dresses, like contemporary apparel, because I am a nerd. I have no better explanation. People are like, why armor? And I'm like, I play D&D. I don't know what else to tell you. And for the career trajectory, the advertising thing did what most agencies do to young creatives, which is grind you to dust.
Yeah, I totally agree on that. Totally agree on that.
It was one of those cultures where it was like, I hope you don't have plans on the weekend because you never know when we might need an extra pitch, you know what I mean? And I was just exhausted by that, and also trying to do my business. And it just became the sort of thing where I couldn't be working to 8 o'clock every night and also be working from 8 to 3 every night on my side gig.
Yeah.
I know Jean knows the hustle.
Fully sympathize with, because you want to do your best, but you're like, how much is my best? And then what is, like, when I get paid for it, does that really actually meet up to it?
Absolutely. And I definitely had that, like, agency experience where they expected the agency work to be your raison d'etre. Agency story, you can cut it if you want, but like, I had a date with a guy who I thought was really attractive one Saturday. I was like pretty excited for it, and it turns out that Saturday we had to assemble a pitch, so it was like all hands on deck kind of thing. It was due Monday, and they wanted me the whole day. But I found that oftentimes a lot of my all hands on deck experiences were me waiting for my manager to give me something. He would want to kind of do things his way and had a hard time delegating at times. So it was just me literally at my desk waiting for nothing. And then as my date approached, I'm just like, yo, I'm going. Like, I don't care. I'm meeting a cute boy, so see ya. And I got reprimanded when I came back in on Monday. They were like, how dare you prioritize yourself over the team? Like, it was just completely disrespectful of you. I don't know who you think you are, that kind of thing. And I was just like, no, honey. This is my life. I am the driver of this ship, so excuse yourself. So I ended up excusing myself from the agency when Lorica really took off. So I did a Kickstarter in 2017. It ended up raising in the realm of like $170,000, which is like far above my $10,000 goal. It was like a week where it just kind of sat there. Like, whenever you do a crowdfunding campaign, unless you're a marketer supreme, if it's like your first go around, you send it out to all your friends and family and you see all their names come up and you feel so supported and so great. And then at a certain point, it sort of stops coming in and you're like, this is my network. Like, this is the extent and we're not there yet. What do I do? So I kind of had to learn how to be my own PR person. And I was very lucky because I basically had to send out one press release. I mean, I sent out a couple, but only one of them had to land for it to like wildfire, right? So it got on a blog called, it's defunct now. So honestly, it has vanished from my memory, but it's like Fashionable Geek or something that got eaten by like comicbook.com or something.
Yeah.
So they're no longer alive. But at the time,
It was, you know.
yeah, that sounds sad that at the time, 4 years ago, so long ago, it just got like picked up by this blog and this blog and this blog, and then like, what was it? Parsec got it, and it was just like, I felt fancy. So, and so at that point, I kind of was like, oh, this is viable. So it wasn't an immediate leap. Like that was early 2017, and then 2018. It just happened that my lease was coming up. I had specifically lived there to be close to this job, so I'm like, I'ma quit. So I did to do Lorica full time for the next sort of like year and a half. It is very stressful to be self-employed. I'm sure y'all know. Especially with a physical product. So I eventually went back to agency land. I was actually poached by some random recruiter on LinkedIn, and I didn't say no to the salary they offered me. So here I am back to doing 9 to 5 and side gig, but fortunately my new job is really great. It actually respects work-life balance.
Yeah.
And pays me a fair amount for this area, so I'm actually really happy with my current situation.
Yeah, that's great. And you have the time and the flexibility to still keep
Right.
working on Lorica.
Exactly. And, you know, my days don't bleed into night at the day job, and yeah, feel very lucky.
So I don't have a wonderful, graceful transition out of this, but there's an old saying that like good artists copy and great artists steal. What we wanted to talk about during this episode of the podcast was sort of the idea behind inspiration and the way that it differs from copying and plagiarism. Inspiration is a really big part of design. I think every designer has a folder or a bookmark tab that just is called inspiration or inspo or something. But there's so much controversy recently around just cultural appropriation and plagiarism and taking people's ideas. And what we wanted to do on this episode with Elie is kind of talk a little bit about our feelings about that and where we see the lines and where they kind of get fuzzy for us too. So I'm Calvin.
And I'm Jean.
And I'm Elie.
And this is 27, a podcast about growing up. And I guess as a little intro before we like really get talking, I'm sort of like a hobby designer who kind of became like a semi-designer. So I wouldn't call myself like a full-fledged like creative. I'd say I dip my toe in. I know Jean would disagree.
You could tell that I'm already disagreeing. Calvin is amazing at concept work. Like it, in some moments it like sucks that like not all of Calvin's things get to make it to the final execution. He's totally like designer, you know, at least like concept designer.
Yeah,
really
art director
great.
for sure.
Yeah, he's so great.
Thank you. I appreciate it. But I say that just to kind of preface the fact that I'll probably be taking more of a like additions and like moderation kind of role in this conversation, just because I want to make sure that Jean and Elie, who are more the creative and especially the both of you have like a lot of experience in like art history and kind of incorporating that into your work. So what are some things that you do to be inspired or like that just inspire you in general?
Well, it's funny that you say art history because I feel like that is kind of my primary source of inspiration, not just for Lorica, but for a lot of things. And I feel like that was a really valuable part of our university education, is that you're forced to take some art criticism and art history lessons. It just gives you such a library to draw from because there are so many cultural symbols that are just embedded in our daily lives. And if you know those references, if you know where they came from, places, people, times, it just gives you such a rich context to imbue your work with more meaning. So I just find that history is the first place to go. And then you can identify all these trendy things. Like in illustration for a while, everything was Art Nouveau. It was just like Muka everywhere. You know what I mean? And then like I remember in college, like the whole like woodblock printing aesthetic was really in, like everything was justified and like stacked like a brick. So you can just immediately see where people are pulling these things from. And it also gives you a little bit of consolation, like how are they thinking of these cool things and I'm not? Because they opened a textbook and they're like, ooh, I'll take that, I'll take that, you know what I mean?
My favorite one is seeing the fruits being substitutes for vaginas. And it's like, well, in Renaissance paintings and like way back then, right? Fruits were symbols of sexuality and virginity. Portraits would have males in like regal outfits and then a bowl of fruit next to it to symbolize like him conquering her virginity or something like that, like someone's chastity. It became this kind of like huge trend with a lot of different companies using fruits as symbols to talk about women's sexuality, and it's like, that's not a new concept. It's a very old concept, like a very classic concept. So it's kind of great to know where some of the classics are coming from, and that way you can use it in your design and also know like when to break the rules for it.
Right. And I think that breaking the rules point is super important, because once you kind of know what a symbol means or what its archetype is, you can subvert it, right? And you can do the negative, and that gives your work such an extra range too, so you can kind of intentionally prey on people's existing feelings about things and twist them to your own marketing desires, right?
I like that word you used. You're like, prey on it. I wasn't gonna go there, but okay.
Or yeah, because culture is such like a rolling snowball of stuff, right? Where a lot of these like cultural ideas from art history are baked into us without us even recognizing it a lot of the time. Like the fruit thing, when that started happening, it like pretty popularly in advertising, everybody kind of immediately got it. I mean, that's also to the credit of the designer doing a good job, but like there is also this cultural miasma of stuff that we just understand kind of inherently.
And then just, I feel like in general, besides, you know, referencing the classics, I love referencing the classics, and Calvin hears me get excited when we talk about like Beyonce music videos. And I'm like, this looks like a Degas painting, like the like reference to the ballerinas. He's like, oh yeah. But I also love referencing like non-designy things for design inspiration. And my favorite is looking at dance choreographies, because there has to be so much balance in all the elements that are moving and things that are happening, and especially when people talk about like the lines of dancers. And it's, you know, looking at that to see like what's the momentum, what's the flow, and how do they really like make a design or make a choreography like reach its climax. I think that has been a very odd source of inspiration for me, but like one of the best, because there's so many things encompassed into it. And especially when it's like when the choreography is focused on telling a story, then you can pick up that like, oh, it's like completing the performance and completing the move and letting it finish versus like stopping it at a certain point. Or also it's like the really tiny things that like make the choreography really tight, and then like using that concept of like the tiny things to put it into an animation design or into a logo design, where it's like these are the not noticeable things that really like bring in everything together.
Like, I think as a designer, you can't just be a designer. Like, you have to be a human who participates in culture and just looks at the world. Like, as you say, it can come from design, it can come from dance. If, you know, for me, it comes from weird objects like armors, or like I'll go to the Met and I'll be like, I love that pillar. That pillar's texture is amazing. And I'll use that kind of texture in like a design of a card or something like that, where I just need some kind of like a frieze motif or something. Gotta look at everything. Be as well-rounded as possible, and that you'll give you the deepest well to draw from.
Elie, for you, what attracted you to, like, what made you look at armor and say like, yes, I'm inspired?
I guess I'm really drawn to its symbolism as like an object of power and authority, right? And it's kind of traditionally belonged to men. Like, there aren't any extant armors that we can confidently attribute to women owners. It just wasn't a thing at the time. Appropriating that piece as this like symbol of male vigor for the female body is like really appealing to me. And especially when I adapt things like Henry VIII's armor, who was not known to be kind to women. I just get a kick out of that. I've said it a million times, I'll say it again. I love the thought of him just like rolling in his grave and all these like hot babes wearing his armor, like go to the grocery store, go to the club, whatever it may be. I just love subverting that trope. And they're just like gorgeous pieces too, though. And the more I learn about it, the more I'm inspired by it, because there was so much mechanical genius that went into making a piece of armor. For example, the waists were actually very, very narrow. So if you look at a historical suit of armor, they honestly kind of look like a modern feminine silhouette because they're very like wasp, hourglass shaped things. And that had a functional purpose as well as an aesthetic one, in that like when you're wearing a hiking backpack, you know, you have that belt that goes around your waist to distribute the weight. Same goes for armor. So if you just had a piece of metal hanging from your shoulders, it would be incredibly heavy and your traps would be very, very tired. But if you distribute that to the rest of your body by making it really tight at the waist, it's a lot more effective of a piece of wearable art.
Totally new information.
Yeah.
It's also like, oh, that's where the silhouette was inspired from.
Right. And I love how masculine and feminine ideals have kind of flip-flop over time. Like, again, you look at these armors and you're like, Maximilian the First had the figure of like a Victoria's Secret model because he was hella tall, had like a 23-inch waist. It's like amazing. And that was like hot back in the day, right? Like a good calf was the epitome of male beauty.
I'm crying.
Like, no, for realsies, like fashion back in the day was like some kind of like loose upper garment and hose. Like everybody be wearing hose, y'all, because these calves, that's where it's at. And like, I love that because nowadays, like all these people, especially in video game art and things like that, they're like, oh, like armor is masculine. It's shaped like a box. And obviously if you need to make armor for women, it's got to have boobs. And it's like, no, dude, take a look at the sources. They are looking like real skinny and real fine. So
Calvin posed a question for me about when it was done poorly and when it really kind of borderline copying. And the one that comes to mind for me is, it was probably in like 2016, 2017, when Starbucks came out with the mini Frappuccinos. And they had this really cool like color bursts design on the on these mini Frappuccino little glasses. I don't like Frappuccinos, but I like that mini cup so much. I was like, I will get a mini Frappuccino just so that I can get the cup. Some backstory about it was that like, I think 72 and Sunny did reach out to the artist before, but she either didn't take on the project or there was a miscommunication somewhere that they couldn't get her in time. But they continue to move forward with the art direction and use her color style, her simplicity to really make the design on the Frappuccino cup. I didn't recognize that it was her work because I didn't know she was the artist, but other folks who did recognize her as the artist were messaging her saying like, oh, congrats on your collaboration with 72 and Sunny. And that's when she was like, I don't know what you're talking about. And so it's tough there because when you don't know the context, it looks very inspirational. But when you do know the context, you're like, oh, that's kind of straight up copying to a certain extent. And in the court of law, it was hard also, again, because I think they ruled it as not imitating because it wasn't there was no direct motif or element in the mini Frappuccino cup that could replicate a painting that she already had. It was just that like the color palette and the style was very similar. So in a court of law, it couldn't pass as as being imitating. So that, I think that's a case where inspiration was bordering the line of copying and really going into a lawsuit situation, which makes it very, very difficult because like what is actually proprietary and what do you actually get to own?
But I could think of some specific examples too that I think are good copying or like good inspiration.
Yeah.
So an artist I love is Kehinde Wiley, and it's
wait, I know, I totally know. I just got so excited. I got so excited.
Yes. So he basically recreates Renaissance paintings in every affect, right? Both in like style as well as pose, gestures are all from Renaissance style, but featuring Black folks.
Yes.
And I think that's amazing. Like, yeah. Like that's the kind of copying where you're using a particular visual language and then appropriating it to say something else, but in a respectful way and in an empowering way.
And I guess to give more context is that he is the artist that painted Barack Obama's presidential portrait. This type of painting style was very, very common, like way back when Renaissance time. And kind of the motif for it, or the story behind it, is that like a lot of kings and really like regal, higher up there males would want to get these grand portraits, but obviously they never featured black men or black women in these portraits because, you know, colonialism and all that hot shit. He is this artist that like is taking that same idea and then like putting black males in it to really like give them that regal sense that they are like definitely owed and like deserve and needs to, you know, help uplift that type of spirit. And this kind of segues again into this common illustration style that I think everyone will recognize through Instagram, and a lot of like female artists do it as well. It's like these very vectorized shape layering or artwork. The artist that I can think of that will help cue in everyone is Jade Purple Brown for the type of aesthetic or reference like visual that I'm talking about. And Calvin hears me bring this up all the time. That type of illustration work is inspired by Aaron Douglas, who is a Harlem Renaissance artist. And he creates these, they're called faucets, right? These faucets of shapes and overlapping colors and vectors to talk about the stories of Black Americans during the Industrial Revolution. To me, the most amazing thing is seeing it prominent in Black artists' work now. It's sad to say, like, when other artists are calling non-Black artists out on it, it's like there is a story and a context behind it, which is why it seems like you're copying. Like, there's a line that says like you are copying versus like Black artists are inspired, because the story behind it really relates and resonates strongly with Black artists because it's really tied into their history, versus like non-Black artists, like it's not tied into their history at all. So it does feel more like you're just copying an aesthetic and copying a trend.
I think this opens a really great conversation about how we can borrow from the past as well as kind of appropriate certain icons to subvert them. But then when does that appropriation become kind of toxic or negative, right?
Yeah.
And I think in many of these examples, especially in Kehinde Wiley, I would not call it a cultural appropriation, or if it is cultural appropriation, it is not in a damaging way, because it is borrowing from a group of people, the old masters, who are all white, who are in no position of disadvantage, right? No one's like, wow, Kehinde Wiley's painting's so great, but Rembrandt, what a hack, right? Like, everyone is praising the source work as well as the quote-unquote derivative work. It's not the best word for it, but the work inspired by it, right? Whereas I think when it's appropriating from a culture or a person who doesn't have that kind of recognition or who is otherwise kind of reviled, it's not a good look to like call someone lame and then steal their shit and be like, well, this is cool now because I have it, right? And I think that's the key.
Yeah, I think Jean and I keep doing this, but we keep bringing in TikTok into our conversations. And it's the big conversation around TikTok, especially TikTok dances, has been this sort of thing about appropriate replacement almost, which is the idea that these like Black creators are creating these dances that end up being changed, altered, quickly by white creators, and then getting all this attention, and then all the attention is focused solely on the white creator who had like taken and changed it, as opposed to what you're describing, which is like a shared recognition of both original and an alteration.
I love how you were like, let's go from art history to TikTok.
Oh yeah, it's all culture.
True, absolutely.
No, but when you give yourself the time to understand the background of things, because it's not to say like the barrier is you need to know art history, you open the doorway to understanding more than just that visual reference and understanding the people it affects, the community it was driven from, the area that it was coming from. Everything makes so much more sense in the design, and the realm of context and understanding it, especially for a brand to like make that brand voice unique, is so much deeper. And like I think about the project that we worked on with Josie, where she wanted to really pull references from her Latinx background, and we're like, let's look at architecture then. And like the structure of the architecture really contributed to the format of her logo, and then the colors from it also contribute to like her brand color palette overall. And so even though we had to do like a quick logo change because she wanted to change the symbolism a little bit, everything still worked, and everything still like was like really tied in well, because all the references and all the stories behind everything that we pulled was the brand. It wasn't that the mark itself was the brand, it was that the story itself was the brand. So even if she were to change it to like a pig flying, if she ever thought of it, like we would be able to spin it to still make it fit for the brand, because it's not the mark that really mattered in the end. It was just the story had to make sense.
It goes to like the ways that you can be inspired by something, right? Because I think the way that a lot of people think about inspiration is that it is purely a visual thing, that you're inspired by like this look of something, and I'm inspired by the look of it, so I'm going to keep, I'm going to emulate or kind of take elements of it and do it into my own thing. But you can also be inspired by like much deeper elements, like the context and the story, which like hearing a lot of the examples that you all are pulling up is really interesting. And a lot of these art pieces and a lot of cultural elements and a lot of entertainment has this deep, rich history and culture and context that's really important and interesting to know. But when it comes to the way that some people are quote unquote inspired by things, that kind of feels more like copying. It feels like you're kind of scraping off that visual portion, or like the top level of things, and not really understanding like where these things have been born from.
Yeah. Sometimes I wish I would just hear people say, "Oh, I'm copying this," instead of like, "I'm inspired by this."
Right. Because you're taking it pretty directly rather than kind of riffing on it. And it kind of reminds me that there was some controversy around the recent Mulan remake, where Disney was kind of cherry picking all these different elements of Chinese culture. Like Mulan lives in forgive me, I don't remember the specific term, but a very particular kind of village architectural style that is of a Chinese minority that is not Han. And for those of y'all who aren't Asian, Han Chinese are like the dominant ethnicity in China. If you didn't know there was ethnicities in China, there's like 100. But this culture is like kind of intentionally erased by dominant Han culture. Yet when we move to like the imperial city in Mulan, then you see all these like kind of traditionally Han buildings. And the story of Mulan itself is actually way older than we generally think it is. And two, she's actually not ethnically Han, probably. She's more of like a Turkic steppe ethnicity. Yet in every retelling, she's Han. Anyway.
It's white Jesus.
White Jesus. All this to say, Disney kind of cherry picks all these different facets of different Chinese minorities to create this kind of like mythical China. And I've heard some critics kind of liken it to in Black Panther, when there's sort of like a mythical Africa that is created to create Wakanda, because they're cherry picking all these different cultural references to create this new culture. And what the difference that I think in success is that in Wakanda, because it is a fictional land, all these different references and sort of from wardrobe to style give it life and authenticity. Whereas China's a real place. Like, you don't need to make up what China looked like. You could literally just like, she is from here and this is what that city would look like, as opposed to just like kind of picking what palace, what hut from every different kind of minority in China and then not giving them any recognition, right? It's hard to talk about that kind of appropriation when you're an American diaspora kid. I found a really interesting term that I did not know what it was of it before, but it's sourcelander, and it refers to when people try to like weaponize people of the home country against diaspora people. For example, in Ghost in the Shell, when they cast Scarlett Johansson, and every nerd was like, WTF, her name is Major Kusanagi. Like, what is this ish? Surely there is some Japanese woman on the planet who will take this role. But people in Japan were like, it doesn't bother me. And so people in America were like, why does it bother you, Asian Americans? Look at those Japanese people. They don't care. I find that this is actually very fascinating for me, because how is it different? Because we are removed from that place of appropriation, right? Do we get to have an opinion? Is our opinion as authentic as the people over there, right, who are quote quote closer to the source? And I guess that just comes again from a place of, how are you treating the people in this context, and then how are you treating their aesthetic? If you are treating the people like dirt, but yet being like, oh, the art of your homeland is amazing, that's a problem. Whereas I feel like sourcelanders don't have that kind of dissonance because they live in the material. They are not threatened by other people taking their stuff because they are surrounded by others in their community who are affirming its value, right? So that is such an important distinction, and why I was really glad to have come across this to kind of solidify in my mind why I was angry and why I was allowed to be angry at this kind of seeing this thing in the world.
Yeah, and then I also I come across that defense a lot about like you said, referring to the homeland, quote unquote. I think it has its own, like, in addition to being like a logical fallacy, I think it has its own rooted racism within it. This idea that, oh, these are the true Japanese people, and if the true Japanese people don't like feel that it's offensive, then you other Japanese people or you like other Chinese people don't need to feel offended because like, we went to the real Japanese people. It's like, are you like I feel like your feelings are still valid,
right?
Especially because like you said, it's that they have other things to go to. They probably have a live action version of Ghost in the Shell. They might have a musical. I know that there's a Resident well, because they have like a Resident Evil musical or something in Japan.
And like they have an Attack on Titan movie, which was not good, but they made it. So
yeah, it comes down to it's a huge representation thing, and representation of Asian people in the U.S. It's a different beast than representation of Japanese people within Japan or Chinese people within China.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's kind of getting into like different levels of processing information for inspiration, right? There's like the first level of inspiration where it's just visual and people can say it's copying or not copying. But it's kind of like the responsibility of the artist, of the client, of the collaborator to get into the second level of information, you know, and like what's the context, what's the community, like what is it actually representing? And then the third level is just like the true understanding of it, you know, understanding it in terms of like context of the culture that it's affecting and really who it's catering to. Because again, kind of like referencing back to what Elie and Calvin were talking about with the Ghost in the Shell movie, where, you know, it was made for American audiences, right? So like we feel a different way as Asian Americans being like our kind of like, you know, our thing being represented by like an American cast versus like if it was to be like for a Japanese audience, like it's totally different, right? And that's why there's like so many remakes, you know, and it's each of our own due diligence as a creative person to look beyond just the visual inspiration.
This is actually a good transition because I have this one question written down. In the country that we live in, is it possible to have true, unambiguous appreciation of a minority culture? I guess an example that I think of when it comes to this is like Moana. You know, it had elements of Polynesian culture and people from the Pacific Islands. They brought in all these people, but it was still a movie made by a multinational corporation headed by white people, mostly staffed by white people. Is it appreciation, or is it possible for that to even happen to an oppressed or minority culture?
I would say that that's still an authentic appreciation. I don't necessarily believe in people like staying in your lane. Like as soon as a white person touches a project, it is no longer like okay, right? Like allyship is real and fine. And especially in a country like the US, where I think I was about to say we pride ourselves on this value, perhaps more we aspire to this value, that we're like highly collaborative between cultures, that we're a melting pot yet leave room for people to kind of appreciate the uniqueness of their own upbringing and background. So I think multinational teams are fine. I'm more like, we can talk about capitalism on another podcast, but that's like the real Disney issue I have. They probably did it the right way, at least in that example, where they really cast people of that culture as best they could. They really consulted people of that culture, and so it was really a collaborative process. It makes me confused why Mulan went so wrong, because theoretically you had all the resources to do just as good a job and did not. So who knows?
You know, I'm glad you brought up Mulan again, because there were moments in Moana and in Mulan that like made me go like, I don't know how I feel about this, where some parts felt overly theatrical, you know, and I was like, are you playing into that a little bit too much? And then there were moments where I was like, no, this feels to me very appreciative. Like, it was really well done in making you feel like overall wholesome with the story. Like, I was gonna cry many times in Moana. So I feel like that part was successful in capturing like the love people have for their culture and the love people have for the stories that get passed through their ancestors. And then there are just, some moments where it was like, I don't know if they need to be in lace skirts on the ship like that, like, I'm not so sure about that, but I don't have the understanding or like the history behind it. And it just made me think about like the Chinatown in LA, where I'm like, you did pick the most extreme theatrical representation of these cultures. So we might need to put a little flag on that, but yeah.
Same with Mulan, where it's like, I see you did your research on Chinese people that we like honor. We like family, and we like phoenixes. So you really hit on everything you need to hit on. If you couldn't realize my sarcasm, I did not appreciate how kind of like tokenized these themes were. It was like her only personality trait is duty, and I didn't you could be a person beyond that, which is why I thought that the cartoon did such a good job of showing her as a full person, and also really representing like the diaspora zeitgeist, because it was this conflict of like, do I do what resonates with me and it is my path, or do I do what my family kind of wishes of me and hopes of me, which I think every Asian kid really feels. So I thought that was just such a richer story than what they ended up with.
I just like how our conversation about like inspiration versus copying has just turned into like, we are so mad at Disney for like for shortcutting us on Mulan here.
Yeah, I think going back to what Elie was saying, or like her direct response to the question, which is it possible to have true appreciation of a minority culture? I think I was on the fence on this, but after hearing Elie talk about it, I think I am leaning more towards it is very possible. And I do think Moana was a good example of it. The question of whether it will be well received or like universally beloved isn't, I think there's going to be, because of trauma and because of like collective generational difficulties and colonization, blah, 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 all that stuff, history. There will be people who will be hurt.
Yeah.
Like whenever you represent a minority culture in this way. But I think that there is, if you can separate from and like kind of examine the process, you can find agreement with the way that they did things. Maybe not necessarily the way that it might have turned out, I guess.
I think the other thing that contributes to it, Calvin, is the impact afterwards, right? Where your intention is to appreciate, but the impact is like, if you only as a company profit off of it, then I don't think it falls into the awkward line of like, are you appreciating, are you appropriating? But if you profit off of it and then like, basically donate, give, or send the money to the culture, like the minority culture that's been affected, that's been like erased type of situation to help preserve the story, the history, the context, then I think that goes into true appreciation. And it's, again, very much up to the folks in charge, the creative in charge, and who's going to take the initiative to really advocate for it, which is not an easy thing to do.
Right. I feel like the best medicine is just ask someone who knows more than you, whether that's a member of that culture, whether that's an expert, just like run it by people, because if you have an icky feeling, chances are they will too. Or they will, or best case, they absolve you of it. They're like, absolutely not, you're fine. Like, for example, for me, when I'm adapting armors, European history is kind of tricky in this day and age because so much of it has been appropriated by the alt-right, like the whole like crusades thing. Anti-Muslim sentiment is super icky, so you kind of have to tread lightly around the like white nationalism and toxic masculinity when you're drawing from that particular era, especially martial history. But I have acquired so many armor nerd friends that I'm just like, guys, this symbol looks a little bit like the Iron Cross to me. Is anyone reading it like that? Is it yucky? Like, has anyone used like Polish Hussar armor for an achy thing? Just let me know. And I think in that particular instance, people are like, no, the Poles were fine. Like, they're okay. You're welcome to them. But I just gotta kind of keep myself honest like that.
Yeah.
Like, for example, when I was designing the Lorica logo, I it was actually originally going to be called Collider because I wasn't going to focus just on armor at first. It was just going to be like a pan-geek thing.
Yeah.
And I liked the idea of like different atoms smacking against each other. So I'm like, I like that idea of energy and electricity. So I had designed a logo where the L's were like vaguely lightning shaped. And my friend was like, girl, that is the SS logo. Do not go with that, girl. And I'm like, oh man, I'm so glad you stopped me right there because I did not see that. So just another pair of eyes, another pair of ears. You just can't go wrong.
Yeah.
Thank you, Elie, for joining us. Is there anything that you wanted to plug before I close out like everything?
For sure. So it'll be a lot of repeating myself because you can find Lorica Clothing at Lorica Clothing on Facebook. You can find Lorica Clothing at Lorica Clothing on Instagram, as well as Lorica Clothing at Lorica Clothing on Twitter, which I don't update very often because social media is hard work.
Totally, yeah.
And that's Lorica spelled Lorica, and then clothing the way that you spell clothing.
Correct. Yeah, if there are any proper Latin people out there, I think the correct pronunciation might be Lorica, but I do not know enough, and I've said it this way for so long that it's Lorica. I'm sorry.
But yeah, thank you all for joining us. We really appreciate you stopping by to check out the podcast.
Yeah.
We're available on Apple Podcasts and on Spotify. Sign up for the Studio DBJ newsletter. You can go on our website, studiodbj.com, scroll a little bit, and then you'll get a thing that asks you if you want to join in. Subscribe to our feed for updates whenever the podcast comes out. The next episode we're going to have is in 2 weeks, and it'll be about whether or not being talented is enough to be successful. So that'll be a really interesting
Yeah,
convo.
it's super interesting.
Otherwise, we really appreciate you coming by one last time, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
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 Oh, and thank you, Elie.